prairie grave. The wind keened a mournful song, a wild lament that lashed Sarah's dark shawl around her face as she gazed at the raw earth. A film of dust, fine as talcum powder, clung to everything, coating her lashes, the roughly made pine casket, the faces of the few neighbors who had dared the storm. It rasped at her throat, a constant, gritty reminder of this unforgiving place, the land that had claimed John. She remained dry-eyed. Inwardly, a frigid lump had solidified, a bulwark against the crushing sorrow. Tears seemed a profligacy she couldn't indulge, not with Thomas and little Samuel tethered to her skirts, their faces streaked with grime and hushed dread. The Reverend, his features almost hidden by a kerchief, finished the service with a mumble. The gale seized his words, scattering them like chaff on infertile soil. It fell cruelly apart John's life, his aspirations now dispersed, lost to the insatiable prairie. Kneeling, her limbs sinking into the yielding ground, she gathered a handful of the parched soil. It trickled through her fingers, an undeniable symbol of bereavement. "Farewell, my dearest," she breathed, her voice barely audible above the wind's shriek. "I'll care for them. I swear it." Thomas, 8 years old but etched with premature worry, laid a small, polished stone upon the grave. Samuel, clutching a worn toy horse, followed suit. Sarah watched, her heart constricted. Too young for this burden, too young to grasp mortality's permanence. The neighbors, their faces somber, offered condolences, their sympathy lost in the squall. They touched her arm, pressed her hand, their gestures clumsy but heartfelt. She offered a wan smile in return, grateful for their presence, their silent bolstering. As the last of the mourners departed, seeking sanctuary from the gale, a solitary figure materialized on the horizon. Astride a lithe, black horse, his form stood stark against the swirling haze. Sarah's gut clenched. Silas Blackwood. He dismounted with measured movements, securing his horse to a nearby bush. He approached, his gaze cold and calculating, assessing her and the children. His dark suit, impeccably tailored, appeared jarringly out of place in this desolate expanse. "Sarah," he stated, his voice smooth as aged whiskey but devoid of warmth. "My sympathies." She nodded, her focus riveted upon him. She mistrusted this man, always had. Something unsettling lurked in his eyes, a shrewd glint that sent a chill down her spine. "A deplorable misfortune," he pressed on, his gaze flicking towards the grave. "John was a decent man, in his own fashion." Sarah remained silent, expectant. She knew Silas Blackwood hadn't traversed this distance, braving a dust tempest, solely to offer commiserations. "I understand John bequeathed the farm to you," he said, finally, his eyes meeting hers. "That's correct." He paused, his gaze lingering on Thomas and Samuel, who huddled near, their eyes wide with unease. "Of course, managing a farm is arduous, particularly for a woman alone, saddled with 2 young children." "We'll cope," she rejoined, her voice resolute, eclipsing the tremor in her core. A flicker of something, irritation perhaps, flashed across his face, disappearing quickly. He smiled, a tight, insincere smile. "I'm sure you'll attempt to. But these are trying times. The bank, you see, they anticipate their installments." Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. The mortgage. John had struggled to maintain payments, especially following last year's drought. She'd been aware it was a hurdle, but not the extent. "John was behind," Silas said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Considerably so, actually. I'm sure he intended to inform you." A lie. John would have told her. He always had. "The bank is not renowned for its clemency," Silas continued. "And unfortunately, I hold the lien on your property." The wind seemed to magnify, swirling around them in a suffocating funnel of dust and despair. Sarah's legs felt unsteady. She gripped Thomas's hand more firmly, anchoring herself to the present. "I'm solely considering your welfare, Sarah," Silas said, his voice oozing false solicitude. "I wouldn't wish to witness you and the boys impoverished." "What are you suggesting, Mr. Blackwood?" she inquired, her voice frigid despite the fear festering within her. "Perhaps," he said, his eyes gleaming, "we could arrive at an understanding. I could assume ownership of the farm, of course, for a just price. Sufficient to establish you and the boys somewhere easier. Somewhere less taxing." He was offering her a token sum, she knew. He coveted the farm. He likely had for years. And now, with John gone, he presumed he could simply seize it. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "The farm remains with us." His smile vanished. His eyes hardened, the guise of civility crumbling. "Don't be a fool, Sarah. You can't possibly manage on your own. You'll forfeit everything. We'll discover a method, she said, her gaze unwavering. We always do. He scrutinized her, his face a mask of barely suppressed anger. Then he shrugged. Very well. Don't claim I didn't caution you. The bank will be expecting its payment soon. He turned and walked toward his horse, his dark coat billowing. He mounted with a supple grace, turning toward her one last time. Relish your inheritance, Sarah, he said, his tone laced with venom. It won't endure. Then he spurred his horse, riding away, disappearing into the swirling dust, leaving Sarah alone with her sons, confronting the tempest and a future that now seemed even more precarious than before. The knot in her stomach constricted further. The land belonged to her. She would defend it. For John. For her boys. She would not be forced out. The wind howled, taunting her resolve, but beneath the apprehension a glimmer of defiance ignited. She would endure. She must. Eviction notice. The morning air hung thick and heavy, mirroring the dread that settled in Sarah's stomach. It wasn't the crisp, clean air of a coming rain, but the stagnant, suffocating air that presaged something far worse. She'd barely managed to coax a fire to life in the hearth when a shadow fell across the doorway. Silas Blackwood stood there, his face as hard and unforgiving as the granite hills beyond the farm. Morning, Sarah, he said, his voice devoid of warmth. Beside him stood a man in a dusty brown suit, clutching a rolled parchment. Sarah rose, her hands instinctively wiping themselves on her apron, though they were already clean. Silas, what brings you here? He stepped inside without invitation, the man in brown trailing behind like a nervous hound. Business, Sarah. Unpleasant business, I'm afraid. He gestured to the man. Mr. Abernathy here has something to deliver. Abernathy shuffled forward, his eyes darting around the humble cabin before settling on a point somewhere over Sarah's shoulder. He unrolled the parchment with trembling hands. Eviction notice, he mumbled, extending it towards her. Officially served. Sarah's breath hitched. She didn't take the paper. She didn't need to. The words echoed in her mind, cold and final. She looked at Silas, searching for any sign of compassion, any crack in his stony facade. There was none. Silas, please, she began, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. Give me time. I can make it work. I will. She thought of John, of his sweat and toil soaked into this land. She thought of her boys, their laughter echoing through the fields, their small hands helping with the chores. He shook his head, a dismissive gesture that cut her to the quick. Time is what you've had, Sarah. And what have you done with it? The farm's gone to seed. The crops are failing. You're mismanaging everything John worked for. I can't allow it to continue. That's not true, she protested, a surge of anger briefly eclipsing her fear. The drought. It's been hard on everyone. Hard work can overcome drought. Resourcefulness. Something you seem to be lacking. He paused, his gaze sweeping around the room, taking in the worn furniture and the meager fire. Frankly, Sarah, you're simply not capable of running this farm alone. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. She wouldn't let them fall. Not in front of him. This is my home, Silas. My boy's home. John built this. Please, just a little more time. Let me prove myself. Proof is in the pudding, Sarah, he said, his voice flat. And the pudding has soured. He gestured towards the door. You have until sundown. She stood frozen, the eviction notice a phantom weight in her hand. Sundown. Less than a day to pack up her life, her children's lives, and leave the only home they had ever known. From the corner of her eye she saw a flicker of movement. Martha stood in the doorway of the main house, her face pale and drawn. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and Sarah saw something there, a flicker of guilt, a shadow of regret. But it was quickly masked, replaced by a familiar coldness. Martha said nothing, did nothing, and then retreated back into the house, the door closing with a soft, definitive click. Sarah turned back to Silas, her heart sinking. She knew then that there was no hope. No appeal would sway him. He was determined to have this land, and he would stop at nothing to get it. Later that afternoon, the sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah and her two boys stood beside a wagon piled high with their meager belongings. Thomas, the elder at 7, tried to appear brave, his small chest puffed out, but his lower lip trembled. 5-year-old Samuel clung to Sarah's skirt, his face buried in the fabric, sobbing quietly. Silas watched from the porch, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Abernathy stood beside him, fidgeting with his hat. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. We're ready, she said, the words catching in her throat. Silas nodded curtly. See that you're gone by nightfall. She climbed onto the wagon, Thomas helping Samuel up beside her. She took one last look at the farm, at the fields John had tilled, at the house where they had shared laughter and love. A wave of grief washed over her, so intense it nearly knocked her off the wagon. She flicked the reins and the old horse lurched forward. As they rattled down the dusty track, leaving the farm behind, Sarah could feel Silas's gaze boring into her back. She didn't look back. She couldn't. But she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The dusty road. Dust devils danced around their worn boots, a rusty residue staining their exposed skin. Sarah clutched her thin shawl tighter, its threadbare fabric a feeble defense against the scorching sun. Ahead, Thomas, barely 8, plodded on, the droop of his small frame echoing her own bone-deep fatigue. Samuel, a mere 5 years old, clung to Sarah's skirt, a small hand seeking reassurance. "Mama, my tummy hurts," he piped, his voice a frail reed against the cicada's drone. Sarah squeezed his hand in reply. "I know, love. We'll find something to eat soon." But her words rang false even to her. Their paltry rations, salvaged from the ravaged farm, were long depleted. They'd been walking 2 days, following the sole escape route from Blackwood Land. Each step echoed the loss of everything they knew. The farm, their sanctuary, the only home they'd possessed. A huddle of sun-bleached buildings materialized in the distance. A meager town clinging to the parched earth. A frail tendril of hope unfurled in Sarah's breast. Perhaps sanctuary awaited, a chance to earn their keep. "Come on, boys," she urged, forcing a smile. "Let's see if anyone needs an extra pair of hands." The first house they approached was a small, whitewashed dwelling, its garden meticulously kept. A woman with a severe face and guarded eyes answered Sarah's hesitant knock. "We seek employment, ma'am," Sarah began, carefully modulating her tone. "My sons and I are willing to perform any task." The woman's gaze narrowed, assessing their dusty attire and road-weary faces. "We've no need for drifters here. Be on your way." The door slammed shut, cutting off any further plea. Discouragement descended, heavy as a shroud. Swallowing her humiliation, Sarah tried the next house, then another. Each encounter yielded the same result, a brusque dismissal, a bolted door, a look of thinly veiled contempt. They were cast as outsiders, burdens, unwelcome mouths to feed in a town already battling to survive. Sensing her mother's despondency, Thomas attempted a brave facade. "Maybe we can find some berries, Mama," he suggested, his voice raspy with exhaustion. Sarah stroked his hair, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. "That's a good idea, Thomas. Let's look." They scoured the roadside, but the drought had ravaged the landscape. The bushes were barren, the earth cracked and desolate. Samuel began to sob, his small form convulsing with hunger and weariness. Kneeling, Sarah enfolded him in her embrace. "It's all right, my darling. Mama's here." Yet, even as she spoke, her own resilience began to fray. How much longer could she endure? How much longer could she shield her children from the brutal realities of their existence? The sun's relentless glare bore down. A wave of dizziness washed over Sarah, blurring her vision. She hadn't eaten adequately in days. Water, shelter, sustenance, they were desperate needs. She gazed at her sons, their faces smudged with grime and etched with distress. They depended on her, trusting her to lead them to safety. Failure was not an option. Inhaling deeply, she straightened her posture, squaring her shoulders. "Come on, boys," she declared, her voice gaining strength. "We'll keep searching. We'll discover something. We must." They continued their trek along the dusty track, the setting sun painting the landscape with elongated, spectral shadows. The vista unfolded before them, vast and pitiless. Hope, once a delicate butterfly, now felt like a distant ember flickering in the encroaching twilight. With a chilling certainty, Sarah realized their ordeal had only begun, and the path ahead promised to be arduous and long. The burden of their survival rested squarely on her shoulders, and she wondered how much longer she could bear its crushing weight. A cowboy's kindness. The creek bank offered a deceptive promise of rest. Sarah's legs simply gave way and she crumpled beside the muddy edge, dragging Thomas and Samuel down with her. The boys, too weary to protest, lay panting like pups. The sun beat down, relentless. Even the buzzing of insects felt aggressive. "Just a minute," Sarah gasped, her throat raw. She dipped a hand into the cool water and splashed it on her face, then offered some to the boys. Thomas drank greedily, but Samuel just stared at the water with dull eyes. Doubt, a constant companion these last weeks, gnawed at her. Had she pushed them too far? Was she leading them to their deaths instead of safety? The thought was a cold fist clenching around her heart. She closed her eyes, fighting back tears. She couldn't afford despair. Not yet. The sound of approaching hooves broke through her exhaustion. Sarah's eyes snapped open. She scrambled to her feet, pulling the boys behind her, fear lending her a sudden burst of adrenaline. A rider was approaching, silhouetted against the harsh sunlight. He rode a sturdy-looking bay, its coat dusty but well-groomed. As he drew closer, Sarah could see he was a man, lean and weathered, with eyes that seemed to hold a weariness as deep as her own. He wore a worn leather vest and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over them with a quiet intensity. "You folks all right?" His voice was gravelly, like rocks shifting in a riverbed. Sarah hesitated. Suspicion, a bitter fruit she had learned to cultivate, bloomed in her chest. "We're fine." The man didn't press. He simply sat there, his gaze steady. "Looks like you've had a rough time of it." Thomas, unable to contain himself any longer, tugged at Sarah's skirt. "We're hungry, Mama." The man's eyes flickered to Thomas, then back to Sarah. "Got some jerky and water back at my place." "Not much, but it's something." Sarah's stomach clenched. Food. The offer was tempting, almost irresistible. But she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. "We appreciate the offer, but we wouldn't want to impose." He shrugged, a slight movement that barely disturbed the dust on his vest. "No imposition. Just offering a hand." He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "Name's Caleb. Folks call me Dusty." Sarah studied him, searching for any sign of deceit. His face was open, honest, etched with lines that spoke of hard work and hardship. He looked kind, but kindness had become a rare commodity. "Sarah," she said finally, her voice still guarded. "And these are my sons, Thomas and Samuel." Dusty touched the brim of his hat in a brief salute. "Pleased to meet you. Now, how about that jerky?" After another moment of hesitation, Sarah nodded. "Thank you, Caleb. We accept." Dusty dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his age. He offered Sarah a hand up and she took it, surprised by the strength in his grip. He then hoisted Thomas onto the saddle in front of him. "You ride with me, son. Your mama can walk." Samuel, still clinging to Sarah's leg, looked up at Dusty with wide, distrustful eyes. Dusty gave him a gentle smile. "Don't you worry, little fella. I won't let you fall." The walk to Dusty's cabin was short but arduous. The trail was overgrown and rocky, and Sarah struggled to keep up. She watched Dusty, his back straight, his movements economical as he led the horse. He didn't say much, but his presence was a comfort. The cabin, when they reached it, was small and weathered, built of logs and chinked with mud. It looked like it had seen better days, but smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. A small corral stood beside the cabin, empty save for a few chickens scratching in the dirt. "It ain't much," Dusty said, his voice apologetic, "but it's home." Inside, the cabin was surprisingly clean. A single room contained a rough-hewn table, a couple of chairs, and a bed covered with a patchwork quilt. A fireplace dominated one wall, and the air was filled with the comforting smell of wood smoke. Dusty busied himself preparing a simple meal of jerky, hardtack, and beans. Sarah watched him, her initial suspicions slowly giving way to gratitude. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his movements practiced and sure. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry into their past. He simply offered them food and shelter. As the boys ate, their faces smeared with bean juice, Sarah felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She leaned back against the wall, her eyes closing. She was safe, at least for tonight. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, things might get better. Life at the cabin. The cabin was small, just one main room with a loft that Dusty insisted the boys take. Sarah slept on a cot near the fire, the scent of wood smoke and pine a constant companion. It wasn't much, but it was a roof, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sliver of hope bloom in her chest. Dusty was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. Before sunrise each day, he was up, tending to his small herd of horses. Billy and Tommy, wide-eyed with wonder, trailed after him, peppering him with questions. He answered them patiently, showing them how to brush the horses, how to check their hooves, how to speak to them in soft tones. "Now, a horse is like a friend," Dusty said, his voice raspy from years of sun and wind. "Treat 'em right, and they'll treat you right back." He started them on a gentle mare named Belle. Billy, ever the cautious one, was hesitant at first, but Tommy, fearless as always, clambered up without a second thought. Dusty steadied him, his large hands firm on the boy's small back. "Easy now, Tommy. Just feel her move. She knows what to do. Sarah watched from the porch, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and gratitude. She hadn't seen her boys this happy in months. The laughter that echoed through the trees was music to her ears. She knew she couldn't stay idle. Dusty had offered them shelter, but she needed to contribute. The next day, she walked into the small town of Harmony, a cluster of buildings huddled around a dusty main street. She asked around, her voice hesitant, until she found Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store. "I need work," Sarah said, her calloused hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Anything." Mrs. Henderson, a stout woman with kind eyes, sized her up. "I could use some help with the laundry. And maybe a hand in the store now and then." The work was hard, scrubbing clothes until her knuckles ached, lifting heavy boxes of supplies, but Sarah didn't complain. Each coin she earned was a step towards independence, a shield against the fear that still gnawed at her. Evenings were spent around the campfire. Dusty, surprisingly, was a good cook, whipping up simple meals of beans and biscuits, sometimes with rabbit or squirrel he'd hunted during the day. After supper, he'd tell stories, tall tales of cowboys and outlaws, of wild horses and hidden treasures. The boys were captivated, their eyes shining in the firelight. One night, as the embers glowed low, Sarah found herself alone with Dusty. The boys had fallen asleep in the cabin, exhausted from their day of riding and exploring. "Thank you, Caleb," she said, her voice soft. "For everything." He looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You don't owe me nothing, Sarah. Just helping folks in need." Still, she persisted, "It means a lot. More than you know." He nodded, his gaze drifting towards the fire. After a moment of silence, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I lost my wife and daughter a few years back. Fever took 'em both. This place, it gets lonely." Sarah's heart ached for him. She understood that kind of loss, that kind of emptiness. She reached out and touched his arm, a silent gesture of understanding. "I'm sorry, Caleb." He looked at her again, his eyes filled with a pain that ran deep. "Sometimes," he said, "it helps to have folks around. Noise and laughter. It fills the silence." As the days turned into weeks, Sarah began to relax, to let go of some of her fear. She saw the kindness in Dusty's eyes, the genuine affection he had for her boys. She started to trust him a little at a time. It was a fragile trust, easily broken, but it was there nonetheless, a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. She started sharing stories of her own, of her late husband, of the farm they had built together, of the dreams they had shared. She spoke of the heartbreak of losing it all, of the fear that had driven her to run. Dusty listened patiently, offering no judgment, only quiet understanding. He didn't try to fix her problems, didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply listened, and in doing so, he gave her something she hadn't realized she desperately needed, a safe space to grieve, to heal, to begin again. Whispers and lies. The scent of wood smoke and frying bacon usually filled Sarah with a quiet sense of contentment. This morning, however, the smell clung to the air like a premonition. She flipped the bacon in the pan, the sizzle sounding too loud in the small kitchen. Caleb was already out tending to the horses, the rhythmic clang of his hammer drifting in through the open window, a sound that usually soothed her frayed nerves. It was market day in town, and Sarah was planning to sell some of her bread and preserves. The extra coin would be a welcome addition, helping to ease the tightness in her chest that had become a constant companion since Silas had stolen her farm. As she packed her basket, she noticed a knot of men gathered outside the general store, their voices low and murmuring. She couldn't make out the words, but their glances in her direction pricked at her skin. Dismissing it as paranoia, she forced a smile and headed towards Main Street. Silas Blackwood nursed a whiskey at the far end of the saloon, the bitter liquid doing little to soothe his simmering rage. He'd overheard snippets of conversation earlier, whispers about Sarah working for Rhodes, about her boys helping with the horses. The image of her, finding solace and perhaps even happiness on another man's land, twisted in his gut like a rusty knife. He had expected her to be broken, begging for forgiveness, not thriving. Dusty Rhodes, eh? He muttered to himself, the words laced with venom. Rhodes, the quiet loner, the man who kept to himself and bothered no one. What did Sarah McKinley see in him? An idea, dark and insidious, began to take root in his mind. Rhodes had a past, everyone knew that. A past he kept buried deep. Silas had heard whispers over the years, fragments of a story about a fire, a lost family. He signaled the bartender for another whiskey. Time to stir up some dust. He spent the rest of the afternoon weaving his lies. He started small, a casual mention here, a veiled insinuation there. He spoke of Rhodes' temper, of the unfortunate incident that had led him to isolate himself. He hinted at recklessness, at a darkness that lurked beneath the surface. He painted Caleb as a man haunted by demons, a man to be feared, not trusted. The saloon was a fertile ground for gossip. The words, once spoken, took on a life of their own, twisting and morphing with each retelling. By evening, the whispers had become pronouncements, the insinuations facts. Caleb Rhodes was no longer the quiet loner, but a dangerous outcast, a man with a hidden, terrible past. Sarah felt the shift in the air as soon as she entered the general store. The friendly smiles she'd grown accustomed to were replaced by wary glances. Mrs. Henderson, who usually greeted her with a warm hug, offered only a curt nod. Even young Timmy, who always clamored for a piece of her gingerbread, hid behind his mother's skirts, staring at her with wide, frightened eyes. Confused and hurt, Sarah purchased her necessities and hurried back to the ranch. The weight of the unspoken accusations pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. Back at the ranch, Caleb was waiting for her, leaning against the corral fence, his silhouette etched against the fiery sunset. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice low and steady. Sarah hesitated, unsure how to explain the change in the townspeople's behavior. I don't know," she stammered. "They're acting differently. Like they're afraid." Caleb straightened up, his gaze hardening. "Afraid of what?" Sarah swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. "I don't know," she repeated, but deep down, a chilling suspicion was beginning to form. Had Silas found a way to reach them even here? Was he determined to destroy not only her livelihood, but her reputation as well? As the darkness deepened, Sarah felt a familiar fear creeping back into her heart, threatening to consume her once more. The haven she had found with Caleb, the fragile sense of peace she had begun to cultivate, felt as though it was about to shatter, leaving her exposed and vulnerable once again. The approaching storm. The air was a suffocating blanket, heavy with the promise of a downpour. Sarah broke from her chore of hanging laundry, the clammy fabric a discomfort against her skin. The wind, usually a playful zephyr, now shoved with insistent force, snapping her skirt and clawing at the clothesline. Her gaze traveled to the horizon where livid clouds bruised the sky, devouring the waning sunlight. "Billy! Tommy!" "Inside now," she called, the wind stealing her voice. Reluctantly, the boys abandoned their game near the creek, laughter extinguished by her urgent tone. Caleb appeared from the barn, his brow furrowed with unease. Abandoning the mending of a broken fence, he fixed his attention on the onrushing tempest. "Looks like a real brute coming, Sarah," he rumbled, his voice low. "Gotta batten down the hatches." A cold fist clenched Sarah's stomach as she nodded. Their small cabin, for all its sturdiness, stood alone on the open prairie, a solitary target for the elements' wrath. "What can we do quickly?" Caleb, a man of action, wasted no time. He gestured towards the stack of rough-hewn timber he'd been using. "Those logs. Brace the west wall, that's where she'll hit like a hammer." A frantic energy seized them, their movements honed by necessity. Caleb, leveraging his brute strength, wrestled the heavy timbers into position, leaning them against the vulnerable wall. Sarah and the boys scurried to gather smaller pieces, wedging them tight to reinforce the bulwark. The wind shrieked like a tormented spirit, tearing at their garments and pelting their exposed skin with stinging grit. "Billy, hold this one firm," Sarah directed, positioning her eldest son's hands on a particularly recalcitrant beam. "Tommy, the rope quick." The sky turned an ominous shade, slashed by jagged veins of lightning. The first heavy drops of rain began to splatter, darkening the parched earth. Caleb drove stakes deep into the ground, binding the logs with stout ropes. His movements were precise, a silent testament to years of facing nature's fury. Inside, Sarah fortified the windows, securing them with rough planks. The air thickened, heavy with the humid scent of soil and brewing storm. She lit a lantern, casting a fragile, dancing glow across the cramped space. Then, the storm unleashed its full fury. The wind roared like a runaway locomotive, rattling the cabin like a child's toy and threatening to rip the roof away. Rain hammered against the boarded windows, turning the world outside into a featureless gray maelstrom. The structure groaned and shuddered under the assault. Billy whimpered, burying his face in Sarah's dress. Tommy, usually so bold, clung to Caleb's leg, his eyes wide with terror. Sarah knelt, drawing her sons close. "It's all right," she reassured, her voice barely a whisper. "We're safe. This cabin is strong." Caleb, his arm a reassuring weight around Sarah's shoulders, added, "This old place has seen worse. We'll ride it out together." The storm raged for what seemed an eternity. The wind howled its mournful song, the rain lashed with relentless fervor, and thunder reverberated, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Sarah, Caleb, Billy, and Tommy huddled together, their shared fear forging a powerful, unspoken connection. Gradually, imperceptibly, the storm's intensity began to wane. The wind's fury diminished, the rain softened to a drizzle, and the thunder retreated into the distance. Finally, as the first hints of dawn painted the horizon, the storm relented, leaving behind a swathe of destruction. Sarah cautiously unbarred the cabin door. The world was a scene of chaos. Trees lay uprooted, branches were strewn across the landscape, and the ground reflected the pale light in countless puddles. Yet, the cabin remained standing, scarred but unbroken. She met Caleb's gaze, finding his face etched with fatigue but illuminated by resolve. She looked at her sons, their eyes mirroring her own relief. They had confronted the storm together, and they had emerged victorious. In the storm's wake, something had irrevocably shifted within Sarah. The fear and uncertainty that had haunted her since losing their farm began to recede, replaced by a nascent spark of hope. She saw it reflected in the renewed light in her son's eyes and felt it in the steadfast grip of Caleb's hand on her shoulder. They had weathered not only the tempest of wind and rain, but a tempest of fate itself. Perhaps, just perhaps, on this unforgiving land, they could forge a new beginning, a shared future, together. Barnfire. The wind held a mournful dirge punctuated by the crackle of lightning. Sarah huddled tighter with Billy and Tommy, the small cabin shuddering under the storm's relentless assault. A sudden, intense flash illuminated the landscape, followed by a deafening clap of thunder that rattled the windows. Then, through the rain-streaked glass, Sarah saw it. A flickering orange glow against the black horizon. Silas Blackwood's barn was ablaze. Caleb, who had been silently monitoring the storm from the window, swore under his breath. Without a word, he grabbed his oilskin coat and headed for the door. "Caleb, no," Sarah cried, fear knotting her stomach. "It's too dangerous." He paused, his hand on the latch, and turned to her. His face, illuminated by the dim light of the cabin, was grim. "Those animals are trapped, Sarah. Can't let them burn." Before she could argue further, he was gone, swallowed by the storm. Sarah watched him disappear, a knot of worry tightening in her chest. Silas Blackwood had shown them nothing but hostility, spreading lies and whispers that poisoned the community against Caleb. Yet Caleb was running headfirst into danger to save his livestock. She couldn't just stand by. "Billy, Tommy," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "Put on your coats. We're going to help Caleb." The boys, wide-eyed but resolute, obeyed without question. They braved the elements, the wind tearing at their clothes and the rain stinging their faces as they stumbled towards the burning barn. The closer they got, the more intense the heat became, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning wood. Caleb was already there, wrestling with the barn door, which was jammed shut. Flames licked at the roof, casting an eerie, dancing light on his determined face. He coughed, shielding his face from the smoke with one arm. "Need a hand?" Sarah shouted, her voice barely audible above the roar of the fire and the wind. He glanced up, surprised but relieved. Together, they heaved against the door, the wood groaning in protest before finally splintering and giving way. A wave of heat and smoke billowed out, forcing them to shield their faces. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Horses whinnied in terror, their eyes wide with panic. Cattle bellowed, their hooves pounding against the dirt floor. Caleb moved quickly, calming the animals with gentle words and coaxing them towards the open door. Billy and Tommy, despite their fear, helped guide the smaller animals, their small hands surprisingly steady. Sarah, armed with a bucket, started dousing the flames that were spreading along the walls. The heat was intense, searing her skin, but she refused to back down. One by one, they led the animals out of the burning barn, guiding them to the relative safety of the muddy field. As the last of the livestock stumbled out, a section of the roof collapsed with a deafening roar, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. Caleb grabbed Sarah, pulling her back just as a burning beam crashed to the ground where she had been standing. They stood together, panting and coughing, watching as the barn was consumed by flames. Silas Blackwood stood a short distance away, his face etched with a mixture of shock and disbelief. He watched Caleb, Sarah, and her sons, covered in soot and soaked to the bone, tending to his animals. His animals that Caleb had risked his life for. He made no move to help, no move to thank them. He simply stood there, a silent observer in the raging storm, the firelight reflecting in his wide, unblinking eyes. Shame, perhaps, or something akin to it, flickered across his features. Sarah, ignoring him, checked on the animals, making sure they were safe and unharmed. She caught Caleb's eye, a silent understanding passing between them. They had faced the fire together, and in doing so had forged a bond that the storm, the fire, and even Silas Blackwood couldn't break. The storm began to wane, the violence of the wind lessened. Even nature held its breath as if in awe of the strange tableau of shared humanity amidst the raging storm. Martha's confession. The drizzle, a mirror of the town's somber mood despite the barn's radiating warmth, persisted. Martha, huddled in her shawl at the crowd's edge, kept her gaze fixed. Caleb, smeared with soot and utterly drained, received grateful slaps on the back. Even young Thomas and Samuel, grime-faced but radiant, were hailed as heroes for guiding the panicked animals to safety. But praise wasn't Martha's focus. Silas, standing apart, a lone wolf amidst the bustle, wore a carefully crafted mask of impassivity. She glimpsed something like mortification lurking in his eyes, quickly veiled by his customary superior air. Yet it had been there, a hairline fracture in his composure. Then Sarah's quiet smile to Caleb, her arm looped through his, sealed it. A long-repressed wave of guilt crashed over Martha. She had been Silas's accomplice, a silent participant in his cruel scheme. The burden was now unbearable. Cutting through the throng, Martha accosted him. "We need to speak," she managed, her voice steadier than her trembling hands suggested. Silas recoiled. "Martha, now is not the time." "It's precisely the time, Silas. My silence ends today." She drew him away from prying eyes toward the hushed emptiness of the blacksmith's shop. The forge hammer was silent, its owner also captivated by the aftermath. "What is this about?" Silas bit out, his voice a low threat. "It's about John," Martha declared, her gaze firm. "The will." Color drained from Silas' face. "There was no will. John died without one. A fabrication, Silas, and you know it. I witnessed it. In his dying days, he penned a will leaving the farm to Sarah, securing a future for her and the boys. You concealed it. You robbed them." Silas seized her arm, his fingers digging in. "You will breathe not a word, Martha. Do you understand? This is for the best. For everyone concerned." Martha yanked her arm away, the sting sharpening her resolve. "No, Silas, it's for you. It has always been for you. But I will no longer be complicit. I won't let you shatter these people. Not after what I just saw." She gestured toward the barn, toward Sarah, her sons, Caleb. "They risked everything to rescue your livestock, Silas. After all you've put them through. Can't you see? They are decent souls. You are not." Turning her back on Silas, Martha plunged back into the crowd. The murmuring stilled as she approached, every head turning. "People of Oakhaven," she began, her voice shaky, then clear. "I have a confession. A truth long overdue." She drew a deep breath, bracing for the impact. John Blackwood did indeed pen a will. I was present. He bequeathed the farm to Sarah McKinley, his widow, and her children. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Sarah, nearby, stared with wide eyes of disbelief. Caleb placed a comforting hand on her back. Silas was aware of the will, Martha went on, her voice gaining strength. He suppressed it. He defrauded all of you. He deprived Sarah and her boys of their rightful inheritance. The silence was profound. Then a murmur arose, growing to a swell of anger. Faces swiveled towards Silas, who stood petrified, his carefully constructed facade dissolving. "Is this the truth, Silas?" A voice boomed from the crowd. "Did you deceive us?" another demanded. Silas opened his mouth, but no sounds emerged. The shock, the mortification, the realization that his machinations had been exposed rendered him mute. The crowd surged forward, a wave of animosity. Caleb stepped before Sarah and her sons, a bulwark against the rising tide. Martha watched as Silas was consumed by the throng, his lies laid bare, his reputation shredded. A meager victory, perhaps, but a victory nevertheless. She had finally voiced the truth, and in doing so, taken a step toward atonement. The journey ahead would be arduous, but for the first time in years, Martha detected a nascent spark of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, justice might finally prevail. Home at last. The will, John Blackwood's last testament, felt like brittle parchment in Sarah's unsteady grip as she faced Judge Abernathy. The courtroom, once a source of her deepest anxieties, now felt strangely protective, a haven where truth finally held sway. Given the evidence presented, Judge Abernathy announced, her voice a resonant decree. This court recognizes Sarah McKinley as the sole inheritor of Blackwood Farm, as dictated by the late John Blackwood. A collective exhalation filled the chamber, a wave of solace and triumph breaking over Sarah. Caleb's supportive hand pressed gently on her shoulder. Nearby, Billy and Tommy grinned, their eyes bright with unrestrained joy. Concluded. They were bound homeward. Emerging into the autumn air, crisp and revitalizing, the azure sky above mirrored her burgeoning optimism. As they approached Caleb's wagon, a small assembly had gathered, their faces radiating warmth and support. Sarah called Mrs. Henderson, hurrying forward, a basket laden with freshly baked goods and preserves in her arms. "We're all overjoyed for you. Anything you need, just ask." Others echoed the sentiment, offering tools, seeds, and their labor. Even those who had once ignored Silas's cruelty now extended apologies and promises to help. Martha lingered at the edge, her expression a mix of shame and burgeoning relief. She approached Sarah with hesitation. I can't erase what's done," Martha stammered, her voice faint. "But I want to atone. Please, allow me." Sarah gazed into Martha's eyes, seeing not the hardened woman she remembered, but someone longing for redemption. "Thank you, Martha," Sarah replied quietly. "We appreciate any assistance." The return journey was different, transformed. The road, once a symbol of their bleakness, now felt like a gateway to a brighter destiny. As they crested the ridge overlooking the valley, Sarah caught her breath. The farm, bearing the marks of neglect, shone in the ember glow of the setting sun. It was sanctuary. The following weeks passed in a flurry of activity. The townsfolk, faithful to their word, swarmed the farm, their energy and enthusiasm contagious. Fences were mended, the barn received a thorough cleaning and organization, and the land was plowed in preparation for planting. Even the old farmhouse, its paint peeling and porch weathered, seemed to sigh in contentment as it received a fresh coat and a comprehensive cleaning. Caleb, his quiet resolve a constant presence, became Sarah's anchor. He toiled with unwavering dedication, his hands rough yet gentle, breathing life back into the soil. He taught Billy and Tommy the ways of the land, caring for animals, deciphering weather patterns, respecting the earth's rhythms. Sarah discovered a strength she thought lost, a renewed resilience. She worked alongside Caleb, her hands weary, her spirit soaring. She cultivated a small garden near the house, planting fragrant herbs and vibrant flowers, a splash of color against the muted landscape. Billy and Tommy, their laughter echoing across the fields, flourished under the community's embrace and Caleb's steadfast guidance. They were no longer the fearful, withdrawn boys who had first arrived. They were blossoming into confident young men, ready to greet the future with hope. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in fiery hues of orange, rose and violet, Sarah, Caleb, Billy, and Tommy sat together on the porch, their bodies tired but their spirits lifted. The air carried the scent of fresh hay and the melody of crickets chirping in the nearby fields. Sarah watched as Billy and Tommy chased fireflies in the approaching dusk, their joyful shouts like music. She glanced at Caleb, his face etched with a gentle contentment in the fading light. "Thank you, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything you've done." Caleb merely smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a warmth that banished the last shadows of fear and uncertainty. "We did this together, Sarah," he said softly, his voice full of reassurance. "We're a family now." As darkness enveloped the land, Sarah rested her head against Caleb's shoulder, experiencing a tranquility she hadn't imagined possible. The farm was more than just land, it was a symbol of their perseverance, their affection, and their unwavering faith in what lay ahead. It was home, finally. Under the benevolent gaze of the descending sun, their love grew, a delicate yet enduring bloom. They were not just resurrecting a farm, they were rebuilding their lives, their hearts, and their family bit by bit, seed by seed, dream by dream.